When talking about suburbs in the North America context, people usually think of a sea of single-family homes that requires automobiles to get around, with little to no consideration of pedestrians, cyclists, and public transit. However, this wasn't always the case. Before the automobile era, suburbs in North America were walkable and built based around public transit. In this video, we'll first take a look at suburbs before the automobile era. Then, we'll dive into how it became the post-war car-centric suburbs we know today. Before we start, let's first have a clear definition of what suburbs are. Dictionary of Business defines suburbs as town or unincorporated developed area close to a city, while the Dictionary of Real Estate defines it as a town or unincorporated developed area in close proximity to a city. Both dictionaries emphasize that suburbs are usually dependent on city for employment and support services, generally characterized by low-density development relative to the city. With the definition out of the way, let's get into the history of suburbs. Before the 1850s, suburbs were generally an extension of the city. One notable example is Brooklyn Heights in Brooklyn, New York. Starting as a farmland, the area started to see growth in the early 1800s when scheduled steam ferries started shuttling people across the river to and from Manhattan. For the early and mid-19th century, Brooklyn Heights grew into a commuter suburb, favored by middle class. By 1860, there were 600 houses in the area. Suburbs in this era was relatively dense and was looked as the urban fringe. While distinctive non-urban suburbs emerged in Europe in the early 19th century, they did not appear in North America until the second half. This is when the notion of suburb as a place distinct from cities started to exist. An early example of such type of suburb is La Volname Park, New Jersey, founded in 1853. These suburbs featured picturesque landscape architecture that had its root from England. Another thing to note is that these suburbs were usually served by railroads, so they are also referred to as rural suburbs. Other notable rural suburbs include Yonkers, White Plains, and New Rochelle. Cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago all had suburban communities pop up along the rail lines that went out from the city's core. And to my surprise, rail was how the rich got around before automobile was a thing. While these places were where the wealthy lived, another type of suburb emerged in the same time period. I like to refer to them as horsecar suburbs. Like the name suggests, these suburbs were served by horse-drawn streetcars. The landscape here was more urban and was home to mid-income families. The introduction of horse-drawn streetcars replaced horse-drawn omnibuses, which carries more people and moves faster. Cities like New York changed their development pattern after they were introduced. Instead of developing land across the East River in Brooklyn, suburbs started to pop up on the north side of Manhattan Island. These suburbs were denser than picturesque places mentioned above, featuring detached houses, but were still considered suburb in the mid to late 19th century North America context. By 1860, horsecar suburbs spread across North America in cities like New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Montreal, and Boston. In the late 1880s, electric streetcars and trolleys were in use, which brings us into the streetcar suburb era. These electric streetcars could run faster, meaning suburbs were able to be located even further away from the urban core. Moving into the early 20th century, automobiles were still unaffordable for most families, which gave chance to growth of the streetcar suburbs. Streetcar suburbs could be seen in cities all across North America. Some cities even had massive networks of streetcar lines. One notable example of streetcar suburbs is Northport in Suffolk County, New York. And to give you a better understanding of it, I traveled there to give you a better look. Northport was first settled in 17th century by English colonists. it was still a rural farming community in the early 19th century. By 1868, the Long Island Railroad opened to Norfolk with its station in the village. Just years after the railroad's arrival, it became a flourishing village on the North Shore of Long Island. In 1873, the Edinburgh station was moved to the current location in East Northport, and the old Norfolk station was closed in 1899. In 1902, a trolley line was built from Northport Harbor to the new Northport Railroad Station. Remember I called Northport a streetcar suburb. I kind of lied here since the railroad connected it with New York City while the streetcar was used for local travel. So it is kind of both a railroad and streetcar suburb. Anyways, with the rise of automobiles, the Northport trolley line closed in 1924 and was partially replaced with buses. On Main Street in Northport Village, you can still find the tracks of the trolley line. Moving on into the mid and late 20th century comes the suburb that is perhaps most hated. With automobiles being the king of the streets, we start seeing what we now refer to as Suburbia, the post-war car-centric suburbs. The rise of automobile can be traced down to a man, Henry Ford. His invention of assembly line production of automobiles lowered the manufacturing cost, therefore lowered the cost for the customer. By the end of the 1920s, an average family could afford to own a car, and there were 23 million automobiles on the road. By this time, many cities have started to design their shopping centers centered around automobiles instead of centered around trolley and pedestrians like they used to. Moving into the 1930s, the U.S. was in a Great Depression, with half of all U.S. mortgages in default. In response, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created under FDR's New Deal, which provided support to mortgages in risk of default. The FDR New Deal also introduced amortized mortgage, allowing borrowers to pay back in a 20 to 30-year period instead of in 5 years. With lower monthly mortgage payments, home ownership increased, and more people moved out of the city to settle in suburban homes. The real boom to suburbia came after World War II. The government subsidized veterans, allowing them to purchase homes, attend college, or even start a business. In 1946, the first Levittown was built on Long Island, New York. It became the archetype for post-war suburban community. Countless single-family homes spread out in the outskirts of the city. This design was what we see today across North American suburbs. In 1940, 90.5% of the country's population lived in suburbs. By 1960, this number grew to 30.7%. By 1970, 74 million people lived in the suburbs, accounting for 83% of the population growth. As people moved to the outskirts, families with automobiles also boomed from 54% in 1948 to 74% in 1959. The boom in automobile led to the passing of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The construction of the interstate highway had great impact to many cities across North America, especially impacting minority neighborhoods. I will be making a separate video about how highways and car-centric planning, so make sure you subscribe to not miss that. The construction of the interstate highway boosted another round of suburban growth. This also led to the development of so-called edge cities, where office spaces were built in these suburbs instead of the old urban core, though these suburbs still kept the non-urban look. Development of post-war suburbs also meant the decline of streetcar suburbs and other early forms of suburbs. These communities were mostly annexed by the city and became more of an urban neighborhood. Despite the spread of car-centric suburbs across the continent, there are some exceptions of suburbs that were built around people instead of automobiles. A notable example is Arlington County, Virginia. Arlington is located right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Developed in mid-20th century, Arlington was no different than the other car-centric suburbs that grew across the continent. A major issue for Arlington was the aging of its population. Between 1970 and 1980, the county's population saw a drop of 21,000. In order to revive the decline of Arlington, a lot of smart decisions were made and decades of work were done. This included improved transit service by the Washington Metro, as well as redesigned streets to ensure safety of pedestrians and cyclists. Today, Arlington has a population of 220,000, attracting ones who wanted to live somewhere that is walkable. There are other examples of modern U.S. suburbs that is like Arlington, though I will keep them for a future video in the sake of time. So, what is the future for American suburbs? One concept that is often brought up is transit-oriented development, which in short means to build mostly mixed-use and dense development around public transit stops. However, this may be quite challenging in the sprawled landscape. A direction I thought of is the rising of streetcars. In the case of the modern-day car-centric suburbs, streetcars will run through the suburban neighborhood streets and act as a local connection to a mass transit station or commuter rail station. This will be a replacement to park and rides. Instead of driving to the transit stop, they will take the streetcar instead. Transforming car-dependent suburbia to a transit-based, walkable neighborhood will not be an easy task, but it is helpful to look back in history to find out what was done right and what went wrong with suburban development. An important factor to car dependency I mentioned in this video was the interstate highway. And in New York, there was a man named Robert Moses who was addicted to highways. A lot of highway projects proposed by him could have destroyed New York City we know of today. You can learn about them in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you over in that video.